She had rehearsed the smile for 3 days. Standing before the mirror in her dressing room at Ashworth Manor, Seraphine had practiced the exact curve of her lips, the precise tilt of her chin, the careful way her eyes would soften when she looked at him across the room, not too warm, not too cold. The perfect expression of a duchess who adored her husband without appearing desperate for his approval. She needn't have bothered. Because when the Duke of Ashworth opened his mouth at the Countess of Ravensmere's autumn banquet, in front of 200 of the most powerful people in England, he did not speak of politics, or the harvest, or the renovation of the East Wing that had occupied him for months. He spoke of her, and he destroyed her. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand how Seraphine Locke became the Duchess of Ashworth in the first place, and why a single sentence, spoken over crystal glasses and roasted pheasant, could unravel a life she had spent 2 years carefully building. Seraphine had not married Caspian Blackmore, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, for love. She had married him because her father was dying and her family was drowning. Aldrich Locke had been a country physician of some reputation, a man who treated earls and farmers with equal care, and who had made the catastrophic mistake of lending his life savings to a friend whose shipping venture sank, quite literally, somewhere in the Atlantic. By the time the debt collectors began circling, Aldrich's health had already begun to fail him. A wasting illness of the lungs, the doctors said, aggravated by years of late nights and damp consulting rooms. The same kind of suffering he had spent 30 years treating in others had come for him with quiet, merciless irony. There was no money for a specialist, no money for the medicines that might have slowed the illness, no money for anything except watching him diminish. Seraphine had 2 younger sisters, Margot, 17, with a voice that could fill a cathedral and no prospects to fill a parlor, and Odette, 14, who read Latin for pleasure and had opinions about everything that would have made her unmarriageable, even with a fortune behind her. Their mother, Vivienne, held the household together with the fierce, silent determination of a woman who refused to let her children see her weep. The proposal came through an intermediary, Mr. Hadrian Sable, a solicitor with careful eyes and an impeccable waistcoat, arrived one Tuesday morning with an offer that sounded like salvation. His client, the Duke of Ashworth, required a wife. The requirements were specific. She must be well educated. She must be presentable. She must understand that the marriage was a practical arrangement, not a romantic one. She must produce an heir. In return, all debts owed by the Locke family would be settled. A physician from London would attend her father. Her sisters would receive dowries sufficient to secure respectable matches, and Seraphine herself would become a duchess. She had exactly one question for Mr. Sable. Why me? The solicitor had smiled, a careful, practiced expression. His Grace requires someone intelligent enough to manage a household of considerable complexity, and discreet enough not to interfere with his personal affairs. Personal affairs. The phrase landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples she chose not to follow. She understood what it meant. She simply decided it didn't matter. So she married him. The wedding was efficient, a Tuesday ceremony in a chapel that smelled of old wood and cold stone. Caspian stood at the altar looking like a man fulfilling a contractual obligation, which, Seraphine supposed, was exactly what he was doing. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of angular, severe handsomeness that made people either stare or look away. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning fog, but the hard gray of flint, and when they settled on her during the vows, she felt assessed rather than admired. He kissed her once, briefly, when the vicar indicated he should. His lips were warm, but his hands stayed at his sides. Afterwards, he handed her into a carriage bound for Ashworth Manor and said precisely 4 words. "I hope you'll be comfortable." She wanted to laugh. Comfortable. As if she were a guest checking into an inn, not a bride beginning a marriage. But she swallowed the impulse and replied with equal formality, "I'm certain I shall be." They rode in silence through the autumn countryside, and Seraphine watched the trees blur past the window and wondered what kind of life awaited her behind the stone walls of a duke's estate. She was about to find out, and it would be nothing like what she expected. Ashworth Manor was not merely large. It was a declaration in limestone and glass that the Blackmore family had been powerful for centuries and intended to remain so. The house sprawled across a hilltop, its west wing stretching toward formal gardens, its east wing under scaffolding from the perpetual renovations that Caspian oversaw with obsessive precision. The staff numbered 43. Seraphine learned this on her first morning, when Mrs. Halston, the housekeeper, presented herself with a leather-bound ledger and the demeanor of a woman who had been running this house long before any duchess arrived, and fully intended to continue doing so. "Your Grace," Mrs. Halston said, curtsying with minimal enthusiasm, "I've prepared a summary of the household operations, the daily schedule, menus, staff rotations, and outstanding maintenance. I thought you might wish to familiarize yourself before making any changes." The words "before making any changes" carried a subtle warning. "This is my territory. Tread carefully." Seraphine took the ledger with both hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Halston. I'll review everything thoroughly before I make a single adjustment. I value what's already working." Something flickered in the housekeeper's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a fraction less hostility. "Very good, Your Grace." That first week, Seraphine did nothing. She studied. She read the ledger cover to cover. She walked every corridor, visited every room, learned the name of every servant. She ate meals alone because Caspian took his breakfast at dawn and his dinner in his study. She slept alone in the Duchess's chambers, a vast room with silk wallpaper and a bed large enough to drown in. On the 8th day, she made her first change, a small one. The scullery maid, a girl called Nell, had been carrying water up 3 flights of stairs because the pump on the 2nd floor had been broken for 6 months. Seraphine had it repaired. It cost 12 shillings and took a plumber half a day. Nell cried. Mrs. Halston said nothing, but that afternoon, she brought Seraphine tea without being asked. It was a beginning. Small, quiet, invisible to anyone who mattered. But Seraphine understood something instinctively that would serve her well and wound her deeply in equal measure. In this house, change happened in inches. Trust was earned in silence, and the man she had married was watching her from behind his study door, aware of everything, acknowledging nothing. She did not know yet that the same silence that made their household functional would eventually make it unbearable. She did not know that the words he never spoke to her in private would pale compared to the words he would speak about her in public. She did not know that in exactly 2 years, she would stand in a ballroom and hear her husband say something so devastating that she would walk out of Ashworth Manor and never look back. But she would learn. 2 years. That's how long Seraphine spent building a life inside Ashworth Manor, before Caspian dismantled it with a single sentence. In those 2 years, she transformed. Not visibly, not dramatically. She didn't arrive as a country physician's daughter and emerge as a glittering society diamond. The transformation was quieter than that, and more impressive. She became indispensable. The household ran with a precision it hadn't known in a decade. Mrs. Halston, once wary, became her fiercest ally. The cook adored her because she actually tasted the food and offered opinions. The gardener respected her because she knew the Latin names of every plant in the hothouse and wasn't afraid to kneel in the dirt. The tenants trusted her because she visited them, not with the condescending charity of a duchess distributing alms, but with the practical competence of a physician's daughter who could set a broken finger and knew which herbs reduced fever. She hosted dinners that were discussed for weeks afterward, not because they were lavish, but because they were interesting. Seraphine had an instinct for seating arrangements, for placing people next to others who would challenge and delight them. She could steer a conversation away from dangerous political waters with a well-timed question about Italian opera. She could diffuse tension between rival families with a joke so subtle they didn't realize they were laughing together until it was too late. Society noticed. Invitations multiplied. The Duchess of Ashworth became someone people wanted at their table, their garden party, their weekend gathering. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a quiet, unconventional way that grew on people, but because she made every room she entered slightly better than it had been before she arrived. And through all of it, Caspian remained exactly as he had been on their wedding day. Correct, distant, impeccable. He fulfilled every public obligation with mechanical precision. He stood beside her at events, offered his arm, made polite introductions. He never criticized her. He never praised her. He treated her with the same courteous detachment he showed his solicitor. At night, they occupied separate rooms, connected by a door that had never once opened from his side. Seraphine told herself this was enough. She had married for her family's survival, and on that count, the arrangement was a triumph. Her father had received treatment from the finest lung specialist in London. He was still ill, but stable, comfortable, no longer suffocating in a damp cottage. Margot had been introduced to society and was being courted by a gentle-natured baronet who adored her singing. Odette had been enrolled in a school that actually appreciated a girl who read Latin and had opinions. This was enough. This was what she'd signed up for. If she sometimes caught herself watching Caspian across the dinner table, studying the way candlelight softened the sharp planes of his face, wondering what he thought about when he sat alone in his study until 2 a.m, that was her problem, not his. He had never promised her affection. She had no right to expect it. But then came the Countess of Ravensmere's autumn banquet. The evening began beautifully. Ravensmere Hall was lit with hundreds of candles, their light multiplied by mirrors until the whole house seemed to glow from within. Seraphine wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that Madame Ferraud, the modiste in London, had declared her finest work. Her hair was swept into an arrangement that had taken Alice, her lady's maid, the better part of an hour to perfect. Caspian looked devastating in black evening wear, his cravat tied with the mathematical precision he applied to everything. He offered her his arm as they entered, and for one brief moment, as the footman announced their names and 200 heads turned toward them, Seraphine allowed herself to feel it. Pride. Belonging. The dangerous illusion that they were a real couple, not two strangers sharing a surname and a roof. Dinner was excellent. Seraphine was seated between Lord Ormond, an elderly statesman with a fondness for Shakespeare, and Mr. Percival Holt, a young parliamentarian whose nervous energy she found endearing. She kept both engaged, drawing out Lord Ormond's memories of political crises past, encouraging Mr. Holt's earnest idealism. Across the table, she could see Caspian in conversation with the Countess of Ravensmere and Lady Isolde Marchford, a widow of considerable beauty and even more considerable ambition. Lady Isolde laughed at something Caspian said, placing her hand on his arm with an intimacy that made Seraphine's stomach tighten. She looked away. This was not her concern. Personal affairs. She had agreed to this. After dinner, the party moved to the grand salon for drinks and conversation. It was during this migration that Lord Hartwell, a portly man with a red face and a talent for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, raised his glass and announced loudly that Ashworth had done remarkably well for himself. A duchess who could run a household and charm a room. Not bad for an arranged match, eh, Ashworth? The room went quiet. Not silent, but that particular hush that falls when people sense something interesting is about to happen. Caspian stood near the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. Lady Isolde was at his elbow. Half the room was watching. And then he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, as if commenting on the weather. Yes, she's proven quite useful, hasn't she? Rather like a good housekeeper who happens to share one's name. The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was enough. Enough to fill the room, enough to reach Seraphine's ears where she stood near the window, enough to stop her heart. A good housekeeper who happens to share one's name. Lady Isolde's laughter was the loudest, bright, musical, triumphant, as if she'd won something. Seraphine's face did not change. Her mother had taught her that. The physician's daughter's skill of absorbing pain without flinching. She finished her conversation with Mrs. Hartwell. She complimented the Countess on the floral arrangements. She smiled at a young debutante who looked nervous. Then she found Caspian in the crowd, and she looked at him. He was already looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw something that confused her. Not cruelty, not triumph. Something that looked almost like horror, as if his own words had ambushed him, as if the sentence had escaped before he could cage it. But it was too late. The words were loose. The damage was done. Seraphine held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned away. She did not speak to him for the rest of the evening. She did not speak in the carriage home. She sat in the darkness, her hands folded in her lap, her face toward the window, and let the silence say everything her dignity would not allow her to voice. Caspian shifted beside her once, drawing breath as if to speak. He didn't. When they arrived at Ashworth Manor, Seraphine walked directly to her chambers without a word. She closed the door. She locked it. She stood in the dark for a long time. Then she sat at her writing desk and began to compose a letter. And she retrieved the cases she had packed 3 weeks ago from the storage room at the end of the corridor. He found the room empty at dawn. Caspian had not slept. He'd sat in his study staring at a glass of brandy he never drank, replaying the moment over and over. The words. Her face. The 3 seconds of eye contact that had felt like a blade drawn slowly across his chest. He'd meant it as deflection. Lord Hartwell's comment about their arranged marriage had landed too close to something Caspian wasn't prepared to examine in public, and his instinct, the same cold, cutting instinct that had protected him since childhood, had reacted before his conscience could intervene. A good housekeeper, who happens to share one's name. He'd heard the laughter, he'd seen Isolde's satisfaction, and he'd seen Seraphine's face, not the carefully composed mask she wore for the world, but the fraction of a second beneath it, when something behind her eyes had shattered like glass dropped on marble. He told himself he would apologize in the morning. He would find the right words. He would explain that he hadn't meant it, that it was a reflex, a shield, not a weapon. But when he walked to her chambers at first light, the door was unlocked and the room was stripped bare. Not entirely bare. The furniture remained, the bed neatly made. But everything that was hers was gone. The silver-backed hairbrush on the vanity, the books on the nightstand, the pressed wildflower tucked between the pages of a journal she thought no one knew about, the small watercolor of her family's cottage that she'd hung near the window. Gone. All of it. As if she had never existed in this room, in this house, in his life. On the writing desk, centered with the precision he recognized as distinctly hers, lay a single envelope, his name on the front in her careful, elegant hand. Caspian picked it up. His fingers were unsteady. He couldn't remember the last time his hands had trembled. He opened it. Your Grace, I have spent 2 years learning the particular shape of your indifference. I have catalogued it the way I once catalogued my father's symptoms, clinically, methodically, without allowing myself the luxury of despair. I noted each missed dinner, each turned shoulder, each conversation that began with formality and ended with silence. I filed them away under the heading of our arrangement and told myself that this was what I had agreed to, and that agreement should be honored even when it hollowed me out from the inside. I did not marry you expecting love. I want you to know that. I married you expecting respect. Perhaps that was naive. Perhaps respect, like love, must be earned, and a woman purchased for the price of her family's debts has not earned enough of either. But a good housekeeper who happens to share your name. That, Your Grace, I did not agree to. I have endured your distance. I have endured your silence. I have endured watching Lady Isolde Marchford place her hand on your arm and laugh as though she belonged there, and I did not. I endured all of it because I believed that the work I did in your household, the tenants I visited, the staff I cared for, the reputation I built for your family name, that it had earned me at least the dignity of not being mocked by my own husband in front of 200 people. I was wrong. You will find the household accounts current through the end of the quarter. Mrs. Halston has been briefed on pending matters. The East Wing renovation requires a decision on the stonework by the 14th of November. The tenants at Barrow Farm are expecting the new roof before the first frost. I have taken only what I brought into this marriage, which, as you have made clear, was very little. The jewels, the gowns, the accessories purchased with Ashworth funds remain in the wardrobe. I want nothing that carries the weight of obligation. My father's address is below. I ask that you do not contact me there. If there are legal matters to discuss, Mr. Sable knows how to reach my solicitor. I wish you well, Caspian. I mean that without irony. I hope you find whatever it is you've been looking for in your study at 2 in the morning, because it clearly was not me. Yours in conclusion, Seraphine. He read it 3 times. The first time, the words blurred. The second time, they cut. The third time, he folded the letter carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and walked to the window. The garden stretched below him in the thin autumn light, perfectly maintained, every hedge trimmed, every path swept. Her work. All of it. Mrs. Halston appeared in the doorway. She did not knock. Your Grace, the Duchess departed at 4 this morning. She took the small carriage and her maid. She asked me to ensure the household continued as normal. As normal. As if normal were possible when the only person who had made this house functional had just walked out of it. When did she begin packing? Caspian's voice was level. He was proud of that. Mrs. Halston hesitated. She did not pack last night, Your Grace. She packed 3 weeks ago. The cases have been in the storage room since the beginning of the month. She was waiting for a reason to leave. You gave her one. The words landed like a fist. 3 weeks. She had been preparing to leave for 3 weeks. She had been sitting across from him at breakfast, walking beside him in the gardens, managing his household, and attending his social obligations, all while knowing she was going to disappear. And he hadn't noticed. He hadn't noticed because he never looked closely enough to see. Thank you, Mrs. Halston. That will be all. The housekeeper did not move immediately. Your Grace, if I may. She paused, choosing her words with uncharacteristic care. The Duchess was the best thing that ever happened to this house. Every person on this estate knows it. Whatever you said last night, and I suspect I'll hear the details before noon. I hope you know that you've lost something that cannot be replaced by renovating another wing. She left before he could respond, which was fortunate because Caspian had no response. He stood at the window for a long time, holding the letter against his chest, and tried to understand how a man could live in the same house as a woman for 2 years and never once tell her that the sound of her voice in the corridor was the only thing that made the silence bearable. He hadn't told her because telling her would mean needing her, and needing someone meant they could leave, which of course was exactly what she had done. The irony was not lost on him. It tasted like ash. He needed to find her. He needed to fix this. He needed to say every word he'd locked behind his teeth for 2 years. But first, he needed to understand why he had locked them there in the first place, and that meant going somewhere he'd been avoiding for far longer than 2 years. It meant going home. Not Ashworth Manor. The other home. The one where it all began. Caspian's mother had died when he was 9. He rarely spoke of her, not because the memory was painful, though it was, but because speaking of her meant speaking of what came after. And what came after was the reason he had spent his entire adult life constructing walls so high and so thick that not even a woman as remarkable as Seraphine had been able to find a door. Thornfield Lodge sat 12 miles from Ashworth Manor, at the edge of the estate's northern boundary. It was a modest house by aristocratic standards, built of honey-colored stone, with a walled garden that his mother had planted herself. She had loved that garden with a devotion that bewildered the staff. A duchess, on her knees in the dirt, coaxing roses from soil that didn't want to cooperate. But Eleanor Blackmore had been that kind of woman, stubborn, warm, utterly indifferent to the expectations of her station. Caspian's father, the 5th Duke, had worshipped her. That was the only word for it. Garrett Blackmore had married Eleanor against his family's objections. She was the daughter of a country vicar, educated beyond her class, possessed of opinions that made drawing rooms uncomfortable, and her husband quietly proud. They had been, by every account, deliriously happy. And then she fell ill. The consumption took her slowly. Months of coughing that Garrett insisted was nothing. Months of specialists who prescribed rest and fresh air and tonics that did nothing. Months of watching the woman he loved disappear by degrees until one February morning, she simply stopped breathing. Caspian remembered the sound his father made. Not a scream, not a sob. A sound like something fundamental breaking. A load-bearing wall giving way inside a structure that would never be sound again. Garrett Blackmore did not recover. He functioned. He managed the estates, attended Parliament, and fulfilled his duties. But the man who had laughed easily and argued passionately and danced with his wife in empty hallways, that man was buried alongside Eleanor in the family plot. What remained was a ghost in expensive clothing, performing the role of Duke while the person inside had long since departed. Caspian grew up watching this, watching his father move through rooms without seeing them, watching him sit in Eleanor's garden for hours, staring at roses she'd planted, speaking to someone who wasn't there, watching the servants exchange pitying glances when Garrett set a place for Eleanor at dinner, as he did every single night until his own death 14 years later. And young Caspian, brilliant and observant and desperately lonely, drew a conclusion that would shape the rest of his life. Love was a form of destruction. It was a beautiful, seductive annihilation that promised joy and delivered ruin. His father had been a capable, intelligent, powerful man, and love had reduced him to a shadow who talked to an empty chair. Caspian would not make the same mistake. He would marry for duty, produce an heir for legacy, and keep his heart locked in a vault where no one could reach it. He had been so certain of this, so absolutely, rigidly certain. And then Seraphine had arrived and begun fixing water pumps and learning servants' names and filling his house with the quiet competence of someone who cared about things that actually mattered. And he had felt the vault door creak, so he'd pushed harder, built more walls, buried himself in renovations and account books and the safe, controllable world of numbers and stone. He'd kept her at arm's length, telling himself it was discipline, telling himself it was protection, telling himself that the ache he felt when he heard her laugh in the corridor was simply loneliness, and loneliness was survivable. What he could not survive, apparently, was her absence. Thornfield Lodge was cold when he arrived. No one had lived here since Garrett's death. The furniture was draped in white cloth, the room smelled of dust and disuse, and the garden, Eleanor's beloved garden had gone wild with neglect. Caspian walked through the room slowly, pulling covers from chairs and tables, as if unwrapping memories. The parlor where his mother had read to him. The study where his father had sat after her death, staring at nothing. The small bedroom upstairs where 9-year-old Caspian had lain awake at night, listening to his father weep through walls that were too thin to contain that kind of grief. He climbed the stairs now and stood in that bedroom. The wallpaper was faded, a pattern of small blue ships that Eleanor had chosen because Caspian had loved the sea as a child. He pressed his hand flat against it and remembered. His father's voice, hoarse and broken, filtering through the wall. "I can't do this without you, Ellie. I don't know how to be in a world where you aren't." And his own voice, small and frightened, whispering into his pillow. "Then don't leave me too, Papa. Please don't leave me too." But Garrett had left. Not physically, not immediately. But the father Caspian had known, the one who carried him on his shoulders and taught him to ride, and told him stories about knights who were brave enough to love. That father had died with Eleanor. What remained was a lesson, burned into Caspian's bones like a brand. Love makes you disappear. Love makes you forget the people who need you. Love is a door you walk through and never come back from. Standing in that small bedroom with its faded ships, Caspian finally understood something he had been running from for 25 years. He hadn't been protecting himself from Seraphine. He'd been protecting himself from becoming his father. And in doing so, he had become something worse. A man who had the woman his father would have given anything to have. Alive and present and extraordinary, and had treated her like furniture. A good housekeeper who happens to share one's name. He sank onto the narrow bed and put his head in his hands. His mother would have been ashamed of him. His father would have been bewildered. How could a man who'd witnessed love's power firsthand choose to live without it? How could he hold that gift in his hands and call it a household convenience? He stayed at Thornfield Lodge until evening, sitting in his mother's garden among the overgrown roses, letting the cold November air strip away the layers of control he'd wrapped himself in for decades. When he finally rose, he knew two things with absolute clarity. He loved Seraphine. He had loved her since the day she fixed that water pump, and Nell had cried. And he had stood behind his study door, with his hand over his mouth, because the tenderness of it had nearly undone him, and he had no idea if she would ever let him close enough to tell her. While Caspian sat in his dead mother's garden, Seraphine was learning how to breathe in small rooms again. Her father's cottage in Maple Cross was exactly as she'd left it 2 years ago, except smaller. The ceilings that had once felt normal now pressed down. The narrow staircase that she'd climbed 1,000 times as a girl now seemed barely wide enough for her shoulders. The kitchen where Vivienne prepared meals was half the size of the scullery at Ashworth Manor. Seraphine hated herself for noticing. She had promised herself she would slip back into her old life, like water returning to a familiar channel. She would help her mother. She would read to her father. She would be the daughter she had been before a solicitor knocked on their door and offered her a crown made of silence and limestone. But 2 years of living in a duke's house had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated, not in the ways people might assume. She didn't miss the silk gowns or the jewels or the grand rooms. She missed the purpose. She missed having a household to run, tenants to visit, problems to solve. She missed the weight of responsibility that had given her days structure and meaning. She missed Mrs. Halston's dry observations. She missed Alice fussing over her hair. She missed the cook sending up scones with clotted cream when she worked through tea. She did not miss Caspian. She absolutely categorically, furiously did not miss Caspian. Except at night, when the cottage was quiet and she lay in her narrow childhood bed, remembering the way she sometimes heard Caspian's footsteps pause outside her door at midnight before continuing down the corridor. She had trained herself not to wonder what those pauses meant. Now, in the dark, she wondered. "Stop it," she told herself fiercely. "He called you a housekeeper. In front of everyone. In front of her." Lady Isolde's laughter echoed in her memory, bright and cutting. That laugh had been the worst part. Not the words themselves, but the confirmation they carried. Lady Isolde had laughed because the joke was true. Seraphine was the help. She had always been the help. The only person who hadn't understood that was Seraphine herself. On the third morning, her mother sat her down. Vivian Locke was not a woman who wasted time on delicacy. She had survived her husband's ruin, her daughter's strategic marriage, and 3 decades of making impossible situations merely difficult. She poured tea, set a cup in front of Seraphine, and spoke. "You're not eating. You're not sleeping. You sit in the garden staring at nothing, and when Odette asks you questions, you answer in single words. So either tell me what happened, or stop pretending everything is fine, because you're frightening your sisters, and your father keeps asking if you're ill." Seraphine wrapped her hands around the tea. "I told you what happened. The arrangement concluded. I came home. Arrangements conclude with paperwork, not with a daughter arriving at 4 in the morning with red eyes and a single trunk." Vivian's gaze was steady. What did he do? The question cracked something open. Seraphine hadn't told anyone the specific words. She'd kept them locked inside, the way she kept everything locked inside, because admitting they'd hurt would mean admitting she'd cared, and caring had never been part of the contract. But this was her mother, and she was so tired of locking things away. She told her, all of it. Not just the banquet, but the 2 years that preceded it. The silence, the distance, the connecting door that never opened. Lady Isolde's hand on his arm, the careful way Caspian avoided being alone with her, as if her proximity were a threat. The nights she'd lain awake, composing conversations they would never have. The 3 weeks she'd spent packing in secret, testing her own resolve, hoping each morning that he would do something, say something, anything, that would give her a reason to unpack. He never did. So when he gave her a reason to leave instead, she took it. Vivienne listened without interruption, her expression shifting from anger to sorrow, to something more complicated. "Do you love him?" she asked when Seraphine had finished. "It doesn't matter. That's not what I asked." Seraphine set down her tea. The cup rattled against the saucer. "Yes. Heaven help me, yes. I love a man who thinks of me as staff. I love a man who can't even look at me without flinching. I love a man who has spent 2 years building a fortress around himself, and I was fool enough to think that if I was patient enough, if I was useful enough, if I was enough, he might eventually let me in." Her voice broke. "He didn't let me in, Mama. He let me serve." There's a difference, and I was too desperate to see it. Vivian reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "You are not desperate. You are not foolish. You are a woman who loved honestly in a situation designed to prevent exactly that. There's no shame in it. There's no future in it either." "Perhaps not," Vivian conceded. "But perhaps this isn't finished yet." Seraphine shook her head. "It is. I left him a letter. I made it clear." "Letters," Vivian said mildly, "are the beginning of conversations, not the end of them." Before Seraphine could respond, the front door opened, and Margot burst in, breathless, her bonnet askew. "There's a carriage coming up the lane, a very fine carriage, with a crest on the door." Seraphine's blood went cold. No, he wouldn't. But Margot was already at the window, and when she turned back, her expression was strange. Not the excitement Seraphine expected, but something closer to confusion. "It's not the Duke," she said slowly. "It's a woman, an older woman. Very well dressed, very stern-looking. She's getting out now, and she looks absolutely furious." Seraphine closed her eyes. She knew exactly who it was. Lady Philippa Blackmore, Caspian's aunt, his father's formidable elder sister, the woman who had raised him after Garrett retreated into grief, the woman who had, according to household whispers that Seraphine had never been meant to hear, arranged the marriage in the first place, and she had come to Maple Cross, which meant either Seraphine was about to be dragged back or destroyed where she stood. She smoothed her hair, straightened her spine, and opened the door. Lady Philippa Blackmore did not sit when invited. She stood in the center of the Locke family parlor, her traveling cloak still fastened, her gloves still on, and surveyed the modest room with the expression of a woman cataloging every crack in the plaster and every threadbare cushion. She was 63 and looked 50. Tall, angular, with silver hair pinned in a style that hadn't changed in decades. Her eyes were the same flint gray as Caspian's, and just as unreadable. "So," she said, "this is where you've been hiding." "I'm not hiding, your ladyship. I'm home." "Home?" Lady Philippa's gaze swept the room again. "Yes, I suppose it is." She turned to Vivian, who stood in the kitchen doorway with the guarded politeness of a woman defending her territory. "Mrs. Locke, I presume. You raised this girl." "I did." "You did a remarkable job. She's managed to throw my nephew into the worst crisis of his life, and she's barely 26. Vivian's chin lifted. "My daughter didn't create the crisis. Your nephew did." The two women regarded each other across the narrow parlor. Two mothers, two completely different worlds, united only by the stubborn conviction that they were right. Lady Philippa turned back to Seraphine. "I'll be direct, because I haven't the patience for anything else. My nephew is falling apart. He arrived at Thornfield Lodge yesterday, which he hasn't visited since his father died. His valet reports that he sat in the garden until nightfall without a coat. This morning, he sent me a letter that contained more feeling than anything he's written in 20 years. She paused. It was 3 lines long, and 2 of them were about you. Despite everything, Seraphine's heart twisted. What did he say? That is between my nephew and myself. What I came here to determine is whether you're worth the chaos you've created. I didn't create any chaos. He humiliated me in front of 200 people. Lady Philippa's expression didn't change. Yes. He told me what he said. It was unforgivable. He knows it. I know it. Everyone who was at that wretched banquet knows it. Lord Hartwell has been dining out on the story for 3 days, and Lady Isolde Marchford has been telling anyone who will listen that she's the true Duchess in all but name. The words stung, but Seraphine kept her face composed. Then it seems everyone agrees. The arrangement has concluded. Lady Philippa removed her gloves, 1 finger at a time, with the deliberate precision of someone preparing for serious work. Sit down, child. You too, Mrs. Locke. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. They sat. Lady Philippa remained standing. She seemed to require the advantage of height. My brother Garrett married for love. I watched it destroy him. Not the marriage itself, which was genuinely happy, but the loss of it. When Eleanor died, Garrett ceased to exist. He breathed, he ate, he signed documents, but the man was gone. I raised Caspian from the age of 9 because his own father couldn't look at him without seeing Eleanor's eyes and falling apart. Seraphine's throat tightened. She had known the broad strokes of this story, but not these details, not the rawness of them. I swore I would protect that boy from the same fate, Lady Philippa continued. I taught him control. I taught him discipline. I taught him that duty was more reliable than love, and that a man who governed his emotions governed his world. She paused, and for the first time, something cracked in her composure. I taught him too well. I turned him into a man so frightened of feeling that he married a remarkable woman and spent 2 years pretending she didn't matter, because acknowledging that she mattered meant admitting that losing her would break him. The parlor was very quiet. Vivienne's hand found Seraphine's under the table. "I didn't come here to ask you to forgive him," Lady Philippa said. "What he said was cruel, and you are well within your rights to never speak to him again. I came here because I owe you the truth. The marriage was my arrangement. I selected you specifically, not because you were suitable or convenient, but because you were exactly the kind of woman who might, given enough time, crack through the walls I built around him. I chose you because I saw the damage I'd done, and I was trying to undo it without admitting I'd done it in the first place." Seraphine stared at her. "You chose me to fix him? I chose you because I thought you might reach him. I didn't anticipate that he would be too much of a coward to let you try." Coward. The word hung in the air, sharp and precise. Lady Philippa moved to the window, her back to the room. "He's not a cruel man, Seraphine. He's a frightened one." That comment at the banquet, that hateful, stupid comment, it wasn't contempt. It was terror. Lord Hartwell named the truth of your marriage in public, and Caspian panicked because the truth had stopped being safe. The truth was that he doesn't think of you as a housekeeper. He thinks of you constantly. He thinks of you when he hears your footsteps in the hallway. He thinks of you when he sits in his study at midnight, listening for the sound of your breathing through the wall. He thinks of you the way his father thought of his mother, and it terrifies him beyond reason. Tears slid down Seraphine's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. So, Lady Philippa turned from the window, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "The question is not whether he loves you. He does. Desperately. Stupidly. With all the clumsy intensity of a man who has never allowed himself to love before. The question is whether that matters to you more than what he said. Whether you can live with a man who will spend the rest of his life learning how to show what he feels, and who will get it wrong, possibly often, possibly painfully, but who will never stop trying if you give him the chance." The room waited. Seraphine thought of the connecting door that had never opened. She thought of his footsteps pausing outside her room at midnight. She thought of the letter she'd left, precise and devastating, and wondered if she had been as cruel in her departure as he had been in his words. She thought of Nell crying over a repaired water pump, and Mrs. Halston bringing tea, and the way Caspian had stood behind his study door on that first day, watching, noticing, and saying nothing. Saying nothing. That was the heart of it. He had been saying nothing for 2 years, and she had been hearing nothing for 2 years, and they had both been drowning in the silence between what was felt and what was spoken. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Still at Thornfield Lodge, as far as I know. Sitting in his mother's garden, communing with roses." Seraphine stood. Her mother squeezed her hand once and let go. "I'm not going to him," Seraphine said, and watched Lady Philippa's face fall. "Not yet. Not like this. If he wants to fix what he broke, he comes to me. He stands in this parlor, in front of my family, and he says what he should have said 2 years ago. Not through solicitors, not through letters, not through you. Him. To me. In person." Lady Philippa studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile broke across her severe face. The first real smile Seraphine had ever seen from her. "Good girl," she said softly. "Make him earn it." She pulled her gloves back on, nodded once to Vivienne, and swept toward the door. At the threshold, she paused without turning. "He'll come. Give him 3 days to find his courage. He's slower than he should be, but he gets there eventually." The door closed behind her. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel, and Seraphine sank back into her chair, shaking from head to toe, and tried to decide whether what she felt was hope or the cruelest form of its absence. 3 days, Lady Philippa had said. Seraphine wasn't sure she could survive the waiting. He didn't come on the first day. Lady Philippa's carriage had barely disappeared before Seraphine began the quiet, excruciating work of pretending she wasn't counting hours. She helped Vivienne with the washing. She read to her father from a history of Roman aqueducts that he loved, and she tolerated. She played cards with Odette, who was home from school for the weekend, and who watched her eldest sister with the shrewd, unblinking assessment of a 16-year-old who missed nothing. "You keep looking at the window," Odette observed, rearranging her hand. "Are you expecting someone?" "No." "Liar." "Odette. You have the same expression father gets when he's waiting for the post, hopeful and terrified at the same time. It's very transparent." Seraphine set down her cards. "When did you become so observant?" "I've always been observant. You've just never been this interesting." That evening, Margot arrived from the village, where she'd been visiting her baronet's family. She brought bread and gossip in equal measure, and within 10 minutes of entering the cottage, she had assessed the situation with the instinct of a born romantic. "He's coming, isn't he?" "The Duke. That's why you're wearing your good dress on a Tuesday." "I am not wearing my good dress." "You're wearing the blue one with the pin tucks. You iron that dress for church and emergencies." "Which is this?" Seraphine retreated to the garden, where at least the vegetables couldn't interrogate her. He didn't come on the second day either. This was worse. The first day could be explained by logistics, travel time, preparation, and the simple mechanics of getting from Thornfield Lodge to Maplecross. But the second day meant something else. It meant hesitation. It meant he was weighing options, calculating risks, retreating into the safe, controllable world of strategy and analysis. Or it meant he wasn't coming at all. Seraphine spent the morning in the village, purchasing thread for her mother and a new Latin grammar for Odette. The butcher's wife asked careful questions. The vicar's daughter asked less careful ones. Old Mrs. Penworth simply patted her hand and said, "Men are fools, dear. Even the titled ones. Especially the titled ones." By afternoon, the calm she'd been performing began to fracture. She found herself standing in the back garden, staring at her mother's herb bed without seeing it, replaying Lady Philippa's words on a loop. "He thinks of you the way his father thought of his mother, and it terrifies him beyond reason." But terror was not the same as action. Caspian had been terrified for 2 years. Terror had made him set a place at the table for her every evening, present and correct and completely hollow. Terror had made him pause outside her door at midnight and then walk away. Terror had made him call her a housekeeper in front of every titled family in London, rather than admit, even to himself, that she was the center of his world. Terror was not enough. She needed him to be brave. And she was beginning to wonder if bravery was something he possessed. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and had a conversation with herself that felt like a war. He's not coming. He might be. He won't. He's exactly who he showed you he was. A man who chooses control over connection every single time. But the footsteps, the midnight pauses, the way he stood behind his study door and listened, that's not love. That's surveillance. Maybe for him, it was the closest he could get. She turned onto her side and pressed her face into the pillow and tried very hard not to cry. She failed. The third day began with rain. Seraphine told herself this was appropriate. Dramatic weather for the final act of a drama that had gone on far too long. She dressed in her ordinary gray wool, refusing to reach for the blue pin-tucked dress that Margot had noticed. If he came, he would see her as she was. Not the Duchess. Not the woman in burgundy silk who charmed earls and navigated society. Just Seraphine, the physician's daughter from Maplecross, who loved a man too broken to love her back. If he came. By noon, the rain had worsened, and hope had thinned to something barely visible, like sunlight through heavy cloud. Vivienne moved around the kitchen with the careful quiet of a woman who knew her daughter was hurting, and had run out of ways to help. Aldrich dozed by the fire. Odette read Latin in the corner. Margot had gone back to the village. And then, at 2:30, with the rain hammering against the windows and the fire guttering in the hearth, there was a knock at the door. Not a timid knock. Not a polite knock. A knock that sounded like someone had been standing outside for some time, gathering courage, and had finally committed before the courage ran out. Seraphine's entire body went still. Vivienne looked at her. Seraphine looked at the door. Odette looked up from her Latin with undisguised interest. "Shall I?" Vivienne asked. "No." Seraphine stood. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her skirt and crossed the room and opened the door. Caspian stood on the doorstep, soaked to the bone. He looked nothing like a duke. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His coat was dark with rain. He had no hat, no gloves, no valet. Behind him, a horse stood tied to the garden gate, steaming in the cold, which meant he had ridden 12 miles in a downpour rather than taking a carriage. His eyes found hers immediately, and she saw everything Lady Philippa had described. Terror, desperation, and underneath it, barely held together, the raw edge of something that looked like it might shatter if she said the wrong word. Or the right one. "You came," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I almost didn't. 3 times I turned the horse around. The honesty was startling. He had never been this transparent. The words came out like they cost him something. Twice on the main road, and once at your garden gate. What made you knock? The alternative was riding back to an empty house and spending the rest of my life knowing I was too much of a coward to stand on your doorstep and tell you the truth." Behind her, Seraphine heard Vivienne quietly gather Odette and retreat to the kitchen. The door clicked shut. They were alone in the narrow hallway, close enough that she could smell rain and horse and the cedar scent that had clung to his coats for as long as she'd known him. "You're soaking wet," she said, because someone had to say something practical before the air between them combusted. "Yes. You should come inside." "Should I? I'm not having this conversation on the doorstep. The neighbors are already talking. If Mrs. Penworth sees a duke dripping on my front step, I'll never hear the end of it." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, the ghost of one, haunting features that had forgotten how to wear it. She stepped aside. He entered. He stood in the small parlor and looked around, and she watched him take in the modest furniture, the patched curtains, the worn rug before the fireplace. The world she came from, the world he had pulled her out of, and the world she had returned to when his world became unbearable. He did not comment on any of it. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew something. A letter. Not hers. A different one, older. The paper yellowed at the edges. "Before I say what I came to say, I need you to understand something. I found this at Thornfield Lodge, in my mother's writing desk. It's addressed to my father, but it was never sent." He held it out. Seraphine took it. The handwriting was elegant and slightly shaky, the script of someone writing through illness. "My dearest Garrett," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what is coming. I can feel it in my bones, in the spaces between breaths that grow wider each day. And I know what you will do when I am gone. You will retreat. You will close every door I opened in you. You will sit in my garden and talk to my roses, and forget that there is a boy upstairs who needs his father more than he needs his grief." Seraphine's throat constricted. She looked at Caspian. His jaw was clenched, his eyes bright. "Don't do this to him, Garrett," she continued. "Don't teach him that love is something to survive rather than something to live for. Don't let my death become his lesson that caring is dangerous. He has your heart, your enormous, reckless, beautiful heart. And if you lock it away in grief, he will learn to lock his away in fear, and that would be the cruelest thing either of us ever did to him." She couldn't continue. The words blurred. "He never read it," Caspian said quietly. "It was tucked inside the desk. She must have written it near the end, when she was too weak to post it. He never found it. And you did. 3 days ago, sitting in her garden. 25 years too late." Seraphine pressed the letter to her chest. The weight of it, the voice of a mother reaching across death to prevent exactly the damage that had already been done, was almost more than she could bear. "She wrote your life," Seraphine whispered. "She predicted exactly what would happen, and it happened anyway. Because he never read it. And because Aunt Philippa did exactly what my mother feared. She taught me to govern what I felt instead of feeling it." He took a breath that sounded ragged. "And I learned. Heaven help me. I learned so well that I married the most extraordinary woman I've ever known, and spent 2 years treating her like a line item in a household ledger." "Caspian, let me finish, please. I've been rehearsing this for 3 days, and if I stop, I may never start again." She nodded. She couldn't speak anyway. He stepped closer. Rain dripped from his coat onto the worn rug. His hands hung at his sides, and she could see them shaking. "What I said at the banquet was the worst thing I've ever done. Not because it was cruel, though it was. Because it was a lie. You are not my housekeeper, Seraphine. You are the reason I wake up in the morning. You are the reason I pause outside your door at midnight, because the sound of your breathing is the only thing that makes that house feel like a home instead of a mausoleum. You are the reason I sit in my study until 2 in the morning, because going to bed means lying in the dark and knowing you're on the other side of a door I'm too frightened to open." His voice broke. He steadied it with visible effort. "I called you a housekeeper because Lord Hartwell said the truth out loud, and the truth was that I had fallen so completely and so helplessly in love with my own wife that it terrified me more than anything I've ever faced. So I did what I've always done. I deflected. I diminished. I turned the most important person in my life into a punchline because admitting what she meant to me felt like stepping off a cliff." He was crying. The Duke of Ashworth, standing in a country physician's parlor with rain in his hair and tears on his face, looking nothing like the controlled, impenetrable man she'd married, and everything like the frightened boy who'd whispered into his pillow, begging his father not to leave. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm not sure I deserve that. I'm asking you to let me try. To let me learn how to love you the way you should have been loved from the beginning. I will get it wrong. I will stumble and retreat, and probably say something stupid at another dinner party because I am, apparently, catastrophically bad at being human. But I will never stop trying, Seraphine. I will never stop trying to be the man you deserve, because you are the only person who has ever made me want to be one." The room was very quiet. Rain against the windows, the fire crackling in the kitchen, the distant sound of Odette turning a page, pretending she wasn't listening through the wall. Seraphine looked at the man in front of her, broken open, terrified, more honest than he'd been in his entire life. And she thought of his mother's letter. Don't teach him that love is something to survive rather than something to live for. She didn't answer immediately. This was deliberate, not because she wanted him to suffer, though a small, wounded part of her did, but because she needed the words to be right. She had spent 2 years choosing words carefully in his house, diplomatic words, functional words, and the polished currency of a woman navigating a world that hadn't invited her. She was done with careful words. "You want to know what the worst part was," she said, finally. "It wasn't what you said. It wasn't the laughter or Lady Isolde's face, or the way the entire room looked at me like I'd just been stripped naked. The worst part was that I wasn't surprised. He flinched as if she'd struck him. I spent 2 years waiting for it. Waiting for the moment you'd confirm what I already believed, that I was a transaction, a solution to a problem, a woman you purchased the way you'd purchase a thoroughbred or a painting for the gallery. And when it finally came, when you finally said it out loud, do you know what I felt? He shook his head. Relief, because the waiting was finally over. I didn't have to hope anymore. I didn't have to lie awake at night wondering if the sound of your footsteps pausing at my door meant something or nothing. I didn't have to sit across from you at breakfast and search your face for some sign that I mattered to you as anything other than a competent manager of your domestic affairs. The tears were falling freely now, both of them, standing in a tiny parlor, destroying and rebuilding something simultaneously. You're asking me to let you try, she continued, but you need to understand what you're asking. You're asking me to trust a man who had 2 years to open a door and chose the lock every single time. You're asking me to believe that the man who called me a housekeeper in front of half the aristocracy actually lay awake, listening to me breathe. Do you understand how impossible that is? Yes. Do you understand that love isn't a single speech in a rainstorm? That it's tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, where you choose to be present instead of hiding behind your ledgers, and your renovations, and your perfectly controlled silence? Yes. Do you understand that if I come back, I'm not coming back as your arrangement? I'm not coming back as a line item, or a household convenience, or a woman who exists on the other side of a closed door. If I come back, you open that door. Every night. You eat breakfast with me. You tell me about your day. You argue with me when I'm wrong, and admit it when you are. You let me see you. Actually. See you. Not the Duke. Not the performance. But the man who cried in a child's bedroom because his father couldn't stop grieving long enough to raise him. His breathing was ragged. Every word she spoke landed on the raw, exposed surface of everything he'd hidden for 25 years, and she could see it hurting, and she couldn't stop, because this was the only way through. And one more thing. Anything. Lady Isolde Marchford. Whatever that is, whatever it has been, it ends. Not discreetly, not gradually. It ends today, publicly and permanently. Because I will not share you, Caspian. Not with her. Not with anyone. If you choose me completely, or you don't choose me at all. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands cupped her face, wet and cold from the rain, trembling with something she had never seen in him before. Unguarded. Total vulnerability. There is nothing to end. There has never been anything with Isolde. She pursued me because I was distant, and distance looked like mystery. I let her proximity continue because it kept other women away, and because I was too much of a coward to admit that the only woman I wanted was already in my house, sleeping behind a door I was too terrified to open. Seraphine's hands came up to grip his wrists. She could feel his pulse hammering beneath her fingers. Then prove it. How? Come to dinner tomorrow night. Sit at my family's table. Meet my father, who will ask you about Roman aqueducts. Eat my mother's cooking, which is excellent but will not be served on porcelain. Let Odette interrogate you, because she will. Let Margot decide if you're worthy, because she thinks that's her job. Be a person, Caspian. Not a duke. Not a title. A man having dinner with the family of the woman he loves. He was silent for a long moment. Then he pressed his forehead against hers. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. What time? 7 o'clock. Don't bring wine. Mother prefers cider. And for goodness sake, wear something that hasn't been rained on. The sound he made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. It was the most human sound she'd ever heard from him. 7 o'clock, he repeated. I'll be here. She pulled back, just far enough to see his face. The mask was gone. The walls were down. For the first time in 2 years, she was looking at Caspian Blackmore, not the Duke of Ashworth, just the man. Frightened and flawed, and so desperate to be loved that he'd ridden 12 miles through a rainstorm to stand in a parlor and beg. "Now go home," she said gently. "You're making a puddle on my mother's rug, and she'll never forgive either of us." He kissed her forehead, softly, as if she were something sacred that he'd only just realized he'd been allowed to touch. Then he turned and walked out into the rain. Seraphine stood at the window and watched him mount his horse and ride away through the downpour. Behind her, the kitchen door opened. Odette's voice, perfectly calm. "He seems adequate." Vivienne's voice, slightly less calm. "You're going to need more cider." He arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes early, which Seraphine later learned was because he'd been sitting on his horse at the end of the lane since 6 o'clock, arguing with himself about whether to go in or ride the other direction. He wore a simple dark coat, no cravat pin, no signet ring, nothing that announced his rank. His hair was dry this time, though slightly less controlled than usual, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He carried a jug of cider and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "You said not to bring wine," he said, standing on the doorstep with the expression of a man about to face a firing squad. "But you didn't say anything about cider." Vivienne materialized behind Seraphine, took the jug, evaluated Caspian with a single comprehensive glance, and said, "Come in, then. Wipe your boots." The cottage had been transformed, not elaborately, but with Vivienne's quiet care. The table was set with their best cloth, candles lit, mismatched chairs arranged to accommodate an extra guest. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the small rooms. Aldrich was seated by the fire, thinner than Seraphine remembered, but with the same sharp intelligence in his eyes. "So you're the Duke," Aldrich said. "Sit down. My daughter tells me you've been an idiot." "Father." She didn't use that word. She used several others that were considerably more specific. But idiot captures the essence. He gestured to the chair opposite. "Tell me about the East Wing renovation. I hear you've been using Portland stone. Terrible choice for northern exposure. You'll have erosion within a decade." Caspian sat, and for the first time in Seraphine's memory, he looked completely out of his depth. Not in a ballroom surrounded by society, not in Parliament debating policy, but here, in a cottage kitchen, being lectured about stonework by a dying physician in a worn dressing gown. It was, she realized, exactly what he needed. Dinner was an education. Vivienne's chicken was superb, and Caspian said so with genuine appreciation. Odette, true to form, launched an interrogation within minutes. "Do you read Latin?" "Some." "Translate this." She slid a passage across the table. Caspian examined it. His eyebrows rose. "This is Catullus. The love poems." "You're 16. I'm well read. Translate it." He did. Fluently and with a faint smile that suggested he was beginning to enjoy himself. Odette nodded, satisfied. "He'll do." Margot, who had arrived breathless and late with her bonnet on crooked, spent the first course watching Caspian like a judge at a competition. By the second course, she had apparently reached a verdict. "You have kind hands," she announced. "You hold your fork the way father holds his instruments. Carefully. Respectfully." It was such an unexpected observation that the table went quiet. Caspian looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Thank you," he said. "I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." After dinner, Aldrich beckoned Caspian to his chair by the fire. The women cleared the table, and Seraphine watched from the kitchen doorway as her father and her husband spoke quietly, heads close together. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw Caspian's posture change. The rigidity melted. His shoulders dropped. At one point, Aldrich placed a hand on Caspian's arm, and Caspian covered it with his own and held it there. When they finally rose, Aldrich was smiling. "He'll make mistakes," Aldrich told Seraphine later when Caspian had stepped outside for air. "He'll retreat into himself when things get difficult. It's a habit, and habits don't break clean. But the man I spoke to tonight is not the man who called you a housekeeper. That man is gone. Or going. Give the new one a chance. What did you talk about?" "Death, mostly. His father's. Mine eventually. How loss shapes people. How the worst thing fear can do is convince you that the thing you're afraid of losing isn't worth having in the first place." He reached into his dressing gown pocket and withdrew the brown paper parcel Caspian had brought. "He asked me to give you this. Said he couldn't give it to you himself because he'd make a mess of explaining it." Seraphine unwrapped it. Inside was a small leather journal, very old, with initials embossed on the cover. E.H.B. Eleanor Hartley Blackmore. His mother's journal, Aldrich said. He found it at the house where she lived. He said it's the most precious thing he owns, and he wants you to have it, because you're the only person he trusts to understand what it means. Seraphine opened the journal. The first page, in Eleanor's elegant hand, read, "To whoever finds this, I loved deeply. I regret nothing. If that's foolish, then foolishness is the bravest thing I know." She closed it and held it against her chest, and the tears came again, but different this time. Not grief, not anger, something closer to the beginning of healing. 3 weeks passed, 3 weeks of Caspian arriving in Maple Cross every other day, wearing progressively less formal clothing, until he showed up one Wednesday in a linen shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and Vivian declared him almost human. 3 weeks of dinners and conversations, and the slow, painstaking work of learning each other without the architecture of a duke's household between them. Caspian helped Aldrich in the garden, following instructions about pruning that he could have delegated to any one of his 30 groundskeepers, but chose to learn himself. He let Odette teach him Greek conjugations, which he was terrible at, and didn't pretend otherwise. He walked with Margot to the village, carrying her shopping, and listened with genuine interest when she sang for him in the parlor one evening, a folk song about a sailor's wife waiting for a ship that might not return. He brought Seraphine books, not expensive editions from his father's collection, but novels he'd chosen himself, annotated in the margins with tentative, uncertain observations that revealed a mind she'd never been allowed to see. He disagreed with her about poetry and conceded about philosophy. He asked her opinion on estate matters and actually listened. And slowly, incrementally, with all the cautious determination of a man diffusing an explosive he himself had built, he began to open the doors he'd kept locked for 25 years. He told her about his mother, not the facts, which she already knew, but the memories. The way Eleanor smelled of lavender and garden soil, the songs she sang while cooking, the way she'd tuck him in at night and whisper, "Be brave tomorrow, my darling," because that's what today was practice for. He told her about his father's decline, the empty place at the table, the conversations with a ghost, the night 10-year-old Caspian had found Garrett asleep in Eleanor's garden in January and had to drag him inside, terrified his father was trying to freeze to death. He told her about Aunt Philippa, her fierce, misguided love, the lessons in control that had saved him from his father's despair, but caged him in something almost as devastating. And Seraphine listened. Not as a duchess evaluating intelligence, not as a household manager processing information, but as a wife hearing her husband's heart for the first time. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Caspian retreated, when old habits pulled him back behind the wall, and his eyes went flat, and his voice went formal. Once, during an argument about whether he should confront the gossip Lady Isolde was spreading, he shut down completely, leaving the cottage without a word, and not returning for 2 days. Seraphine didn't chase him. She waited. And when he appeared on the 3rd morning, shame-faced and holding wildflowers he'd clearly picked himself because they were half crushed and missing most of their stems. She took them and put them in water and said, "Don't disappear again. If you need space, tell me. But don't vanish. Your father vanished and look what it cost." He nodded. He didn't vanish again. On the 22nd day, Seraphine made a decision. She found Caspian in her father's garden, helping Aldrich stake tomato plants that had no business being staked in November, but which Aldrich insisted on preserving. His coat was off. There was dirt on his hands. He was arguing companionably with her father about irrigation methods, and when he saw her approaching, he smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression she'd seen for 2 years, a real smile, unguarded, warm, the smile of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of his own face. "I want to come home," she said. He went very still, the tomato stake forgotten in his hand. Aldrich looked between them, set down his trowel, and retreated into the cottage with remarkable speed for a man with failing lungs. "Home," Caspian repeated carefully. "Ashworth Manor. Our home. But I have conditions." "Of course you do." She caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I'd be worried if you didn't. First, the connecting door between our rooms stays open. Always. I don't care if we argue, if you need space, if you're having the worst day of your life. That door stays open because closed doors are how we got here. Done. Second, I want to visit Thornfield Lodge. I want to see your mother's garden. I want to plant something there with you. Something new, something that's ours. Not a memorial, a beginning." His eyes went bright. He nodded because his voice, she suspected, couldn't be trusted. Third, you write a letter to every person who was at that banquet. You don't grovel. You don't make excuses. You simply tell them that the Duchess of Ashworth is the finest woman you've ever known, and that any man who fails to recognize that is a fool, including and especially you. Seraphine, I mean it. Every single person. Lord Hartwell, the Countess of Ravensmere, Lady Isolde. Everyone. I won't return to a house where people believe I'm tolerated. If I come back as your wife in every sense, publicly acknowledged, publicly valued, and publicly loved. He set down the tomato stake. He crossed the garden in 3 strides. He took her hands, dirt and all. "I'll write the letters tonight. Every one. And then I'll hand-deliver them, because a letter is the beginning of a conversation, not the end." She stared at him. "That's what my mother said. Then your mother is wiser than everyone in my family combined," which frankly, I already suspected. He pulled her close, his arms around her, his face in her hair, and this time, there was no performance, no formality, no careful distance. Just 2 people holding each other in a vegetable garden while a dying physician watched from the kitchen window and wept quietly into his handkerchief. "I love you," Caspian murmured against her hair. "I love you, and I'm sorry, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt either of those things again." She pulled back and looked at him, the boy with the wallpaper ships, the man who'd ridden through a rainstorm, the duke who'd gotten dirt on his hands and argued about tomatoes with a country physician. She kissed him. Properly. The way she'd wanted to for 2 years, and had never once allowed herself to imagine. His hands tightened on her back. She felt him shake. She felt herself shake. And she didn't care that the neighbors could probably see, or that Odette was undoubtedly watching from an upstairs window with a running commentary, or that Margot would arrive within the hour and demand a full report. "Take me home," she whispered. They returned to Ashworth Manor on a Thursday. The staff lined the entrance hall, which Seraphine later learned was Mrs. Halston's doing. The housekeeper had received word of their arrival and had organized a welcome with the precision of a military campaign. Every servant, from the butler to the boot boy, stood in formation. The silver was polished. The fires were lit. The Duchess's chambers, where Seraphine had spent her first lonely nights, had been reorganized. Her belongings moved into the master suite alongside Caspian's. The connecting door between them had been removed from its hinges entirely. Mrs. Halston met them at the door. She curtsied to Caspian, then turned to Seraphine, and the iron composure that had governed her face for decades cracked just enough to reveal something raw and true. "Welcome home, Your Grace." She took Seraphine's hands, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "We've been waiting." Behind her, Nell, the scullery maid, was crying again. Alice was beaming. Even the cook had emerged from the kitchen, flour on her apron and tears in her eyes. Seraphine looked at the hall, at the portraits and the marble and the soaring ceilings. The same house she'd left in the dark of an October morning with a single trunk and a letter on the desk. The same walls, the same rooms, the same cool grandeur. But different, because this time, the man beside her took her hand in front of everyone and didn't let go. The letters went out that week, 47 of them, individually written in Caspian's precise hand. Not the carefully diplomatic correspondence of a duke managing his reputation, something rawer, more personal, more costly. To Lord Hartwell, "You asked me if I'd done well for myself. The answer is yes, better than I deserved and better than I knew. My wife is not merely a credit to my household. She is the heart of it, and I was a fool to suggest otherwise. To the Countess of Ravensmere, I owe you an apology for desecrating your hospitality with an act of cowardice disguised as wit. The Duchess sends her regards and hopes to attend your spring gathering, if you'll have us. To Lady Isolde Marchford, there has been a misunderstanding between us that I allowed to persist through negligence. I must be explicit where I should have been clear long ago. My wife has my complete devotion. There is no ambiguity to manage and no encouragement to infer. I wish you well." The responses varied. Several were gracious. A few were frosty. Lord Hartwell sent a case of wine with a note that read, "About time, you impossible man." Lady Isolde did not respond at all, but her abrupt departure from London for an extended visit to her sister in Bath spoke volumes. Society, which had feasted on the scandal, found itself confronted with something unexpected. A duke who had publicly diminished his wife, and then publicly repented, with raw, uncomfortable honesty, delivered in his own handwriting to every witness. Old Mrs. Penworth, hearing about it through the village chain of gossip, declared it the finest thing a man had done since her own husband apologized for overcooking the Christmas goose in 1792. They planted the garden at Thornfield Lodge in early December. It was too late in the season for most things, but Seraphine had chosen winter jasmine and hellebore, plants that bloomed in the coldest months, that flowered when everything else had retreated into dormancy. A garden that thrived in darkness. It seemed fitting. Caspian dug the beds himself. No groundskeeper, no staff, no, just a duke with blistered hands and muddy knees, working alongside his wife in his dead mother's garden. When they finished, they stood side by side, looking at the freshly turned earth. "She would have liked you," Caspian said quietly. "My mother. She would have liked you very much. I think I would have liked her, too." She sounded like a woman who understood that love isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do in spite of it. He took her hand, dirt under both their nails. And Seraphine thought of Eleanor's journal, of the woman who had loved deeply and regretted nothing, and she understood something that the faded ships on a child's wallpaper had been trying to teach for 25 years. Love was not what had destroyed Garrett Blackmore. Silence was. Grief unspoken, love unexpressed, doors closed against the very people who could have helped carry the weight. Eleanor had known it. She'd written the warning. It had arrived too late, but not for Caspian, not for them. On Christmas Eve, Seraphine's entire family came to Ashworth Manor. Aldrich sat in the library and discussed architecture with Caspian for 3 hours. Vivian took command of the kitchen alongside the cook. Odette discovered the library's classical section and was not seen again until dinner. Margot sang carols in the grand hall, her voice filling the vast space with warmth it hadn't known in years. Lady Philippa arrived unannounced, declared the table settings provincial, then sat down and ate 3 helpings of Vivian's plum pudding. At midnight, after the family had retired, Caspian and Seraphine stood in the corridor between their rooms. The door was gone. The opening between their lives was just that. An opening. Unobstructed. Permanent. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. A brass door hinge, old and slightly tarnished. "I kept it," he said, "from when Mrs. Halston had the door removed. She wanted to throw it away. I asked her to save it. Why? Because I never want to forget what a closed door costs." He placed it in her palm. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the cold metal warm against her skin. Caspian. Open the journal. Your mother's journal. The last page. He looked at her quizzically, but retrieved the journal from the bedside table. She had placed a ribbon at the final entry. He opened it and read aloud. "If my boy finds someone who makes his world larger instead of smaller, who opens doors instead of closing them, who plants gardens in winter because she believes that even the coldest season holds the promise of bloom, then everything, the pain, the love, the brevity of it all, will have been worth it. Be brave, my darling." That's what today practice was for. His voice failed on the last line. Seraphine took the journal gently from his hands and set it aside. She cupped his face, this complicated, broken, rebuilding man, and kissed him with all the patience and fury and tenderness of 2 years of silence, finally, blessedly, broken. "This is what she chose," Seraphine whispered. "Not the grief, not the fear. This. Us. Right now." And Caspian, the Duke of Ashworth, who had spent his entire life protecting himself from exactly this moment, let go of the last wall and wept in his wife's arms on Christmas Eve, in a doorway that would never close again. Years later, visitors to Ashworth Manor would notice 2 things. First, that there were no doors between the Duke's chambers and the Duchess's, just an open archway, wide and unobstructed, through which light and conversation and laughter passed freely. And second, that in the entrance hall, mounted in a small glass case beside the family portraits, was an old brass door hinge. Polished now, almost beautiful in its simplicity. Beneath it, a small brass plate, engraved with 2 words in the Duchess's handwriting. "Never again. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist. Because you believe in love that chooses honesty over hiding, in people who fight for each other, even when they've hurt each other, in endings that feel earned because the journey demanded everything. Do you have a favorite line or scene? Your engagement helps me understand what moves you and what kinds of stories to create next." Consider subscribing if you'd like more stories with emotional depth and genuine character growth. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.